Thanks everyone for joining us. So my name is Andrew Zeller. I'll be talking to you today about facilities innovation, broadly speaking. I got my background in this helping start a particularly, I'll say, unique and complex charter school, and really getting that off the ground and kind of every aspect of that. And then since then have kind of expanded into helping a number of other schools think through creative uses of their space and creative solutions to space and kind of financial constraints around facilities as well. So there's really kind of maybe three major takeaways that kind of are on top of all the more specific things that I'll talk about. One of those is just that anytime you're working with facilities innovation, there's a tendency, I think, to think of it as something that can be cabined and put away from maybe the rest of conversations about what a school does. And that's just not the case. So facilities have a tremendous impact on just how the day-to-day operations of every other aspect of the school work. So it's not just about facilities. As you'll see from sort of some of the examples I'll give, it's just as much about curriculum and how it gets implemented, just as much about teaching and how teachers go about their job and when they go about their job. It's just as much about what technology tools a school selects. And so really, anytime you're working in facilities innovation, again, there's maybe a tendency to cabinet and say, well, we can just hire facilities people, or we can sort of have a committee looking at it that's kind of separate and maybe mechanical to a certain degree. And that's just really kind of not the way to go about it. And having a fully inclusive process that involves everyone that would be involved in a curriculum decision, everyone that would be involved in a technology decision, is really critical. The second thing that I want to just mention is, as I go through these things, all of the things I'm going to talk about are meant as idea generators. They're not meant as these are ideas that should work for any particular school. Every school is different. Every school's model is different. Kind of going back to the first point that it's not just about facilities. The facility choices should be tightly controlled and driven by what the model and mission of the school are. And so what's right for one school is in almost certainly not right for another school, at least in some details. It'll vary somewhat from school to school. And then, like any kind of sustainable innovation, any kind of facilities innovation has to be an inclusive process. So not just because it's tightly connected to how curriculum works and how technology works and other aspects of the school day, but simply from a perspective of kind of any of the things that we're going to talk about, making it work on a practical level and making it sustainable. So it's not something that comes in and it's a change and one leader perhaps kind of proposes it and goes forward with it, but then it kind of falls by the wayside or receives pushback. It has to be an inclusive process. And so we'll also talk, after kind of talking about some of the dimensions of how to think about what things can be innovated with facilities in general, I'll actually turn to a more general conversation on what an innovation sort of management process and an innovation practice can look like for schools. So really thinking first about, what are the types of things you can change with facility innovation? I think generally people think pretty pictures a lot. As soon as you go to facility innovation, it's like, well, what's the flashiest new building? And that's really not how I think about it, and definitely not sort of what I'm going to be talking about. So while some of those flashy features are definitely, can help be components of facilitating some of those facility innovations, the idea here is more, how does a school respond to constraints? How does a school do new and unique things that help its model? And so along that sort of dimension, there are really kind of three dimensions that think about facilities innovation. Space, and so where the activity is happening. Use, So what activity is happening inside a given space? And then time. When is that activity happening in that given space and for that given use? All of these three dimensions wrap in on themselves and are very connected and kind of inseparable from each other, as will also be clear as we get into more examples. But really the idea of breaking it down into these kind of three things is to help generate more conversation and more ideas as you have these sorts of facility planning and facility innovation conversations with your teams, your families, your parents, your teachers, and your administrators. So kind of taking them one at a time. So, and I'll also say a lot of the impetus behind doing this kind of presentation now is that schools are very uniquely situated right now to do much more in the way of facilities innovation along all three of these dimensions than they ever have before. Because sort of by necessity, schools did this and administrators implemented these and parents and teachers and students all adjusted to lots of these things by necessity for the pandemic. And now that they've had maybe a chance to get back to normal a bit, there's space and time to think through how can certain aspects of things that by necessity had to change and definitely didn't change along the timeline or the process, certainly not the sort of sustainable, inclusive process that we'll talk about. But what parts of those changes can be capitalized on moving forward? And so in each of these cases, each of these dimensions, I'll sort of start by positioning it in terms of, well, what did the pandemic show was a different way to think about facilities? And so that's really what the two pictures on the farthest left are. So one aspect of where activities happen is that was necessitated by the pandemic is suddenly school wasn't happening in the school building, it was happening in students' homes, right? And if you're an educator like me, you probably saw a lot of ceiling fans over the last couple of years on Zoom. So the point simply being, obviously that is not ideal. We've all loved getting back to in-person, real, true human connections with students. But there might be something to be said of maybe some activities could happen that way. And from a facilities perspective, especially for charter schools where there are more significant budget constraints, it enables you to have different priorities for what happens with your facility itself. You can have smaller group interactions in your facility itself. You can cut down on the amount of facility you need, or you can add on extra things you might not have been able to purchase if you offload some of the aspects of your facility that you wouldn't normally have been able to offload in kind of a pre-pandemic world where there wasn't this idea that, well, work from home is a thing, right? And we know that it can work for some things really well, and it doesn't work well for other things. And so being intentional about thinking about what are the characteristics of what we do as schools that could continue in that manner, where part of these activities can be in a traditional school facility and part of them can be outside, is well worth thinking about. And then kind of along that same dimension of space where things are happening, it doesn't just have to be the difference between school building and home. There's also lots of schools that take advantage of entirely other spaces. And so this middle example is an example of a really neat, innovative school, the Public Museum School in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And so their school is this public museum, this historic community space, and they utilize the city and the museum itself as their classroom. And so this is another example of, and again, especially for charter schools where you're more resource constrained, they have a very different budget per se than a charter school that's trying to craft the entirety of its own facilities. It's using what's already existent in the community itself and taking full advantage of that. Now, that's a school that literally built the entire school around the idea that the city and this museum are its classrooms, are its school, but it doesn't have to be to that extent. So it can be, if there is community space like that, if there's a community asset like that, leveraging something like that, even for one class or for one period, starts to take strain off of your facility constraints and allows you more other opportunities in the facility, in the sort of traditional facilities that you do have. And that's the idea with the space on the right side of the screen as well. So this could be a science lab that's in a local company and maybe doesn't get used 24/7 every day. This could be a science lab in a local university or community college. And so exploring the kinds of partnerships that might be available, I'll say that that's a professional lab in that photo of a quality that, quite frankly, very, very few schools could ever reach. But maybe it would be a really interesting program for some advanced students, say at the high school level, and a tremendous opportunity if you're able to sort of bridge that gap. And again, the more that you start leveraging these other spaces besides your own space, the more opportunities your students have, but then the more opportunities you have to be creative with your own space itself. And so that's kind of the space dimension, or the idea of the space dimension, where activities happen. And then there's the use dimension. So now it's more looking at traditional spaces that you'd have inside your school, but what's going on in those particular spaces. And so the canonical example that everyone is familiar with from all time is the multi-purpose space, the cafeteria, gymnasium, sometimes auditorium, mixed use space that so many schools have. It's a terrific example of creative use of space where you don't need all of those three things all of the time. You just need each one of them some of the time, and being able to use a space in a particularly different way helps enable that. More and more we see things where, for instance, you have the garage doors that are in that center photo, where you're enabling a classroom that would be a certain size, a defined size, to be able to be opened up into maybe twice the size as it would have previously been. And so those are the kinds of flexible use of space. Even the selection of what type of furniture you're using. Obviously, the furniture in that garage door photo is not the rows of desks all lined up facing the front that would have been more typical, in the past for a classroom. So flexible use of space and designing for that. And then that can go even further. So in this sort of reverse direction from saying what community assets already exist, like the public museum or like that professional lab that exists somewhere in the community, you can reverse that and say, we're going to engineer a space that we want, like a theater or like a makerspace, as are in these photos. But we maybe don't have the resources to do that by ourselves. And so if we think of the use of our school solely as our school, we might not ever be able to do that. Again, especially as charter schools where there's a greater resource constraint. But if we start to think, how can we use those spaces creatively together with the community? There might be a local theater troupe that has always wanted to have its own space, maybe has access to its own grant money or own donors. And if you leverage sort of the combination of, well, we use it for these purposes during school hours, but then it opens up to the community later on. Obviously, lots of schools have historically done that, where there's a community auditorium perhaps as part of the school that gets used not just for the school's sort of events during school or sometimes after school, but it gets used for all kinds of community events in the same way. That's maybe been more dominant on kind of the traditional neighborhood school model, but there's nothing that prevents, as charter school, for example, from establishing those sorts of partnerships with different community organizations and then helping create school spaces that it couldn't sustain on its own. Same thing goes for this makerspace below. If you have a community organization that has access, again, to potentially different lines of grant funding, different donors, even potentially commercial avenues for having people be able to rent use of the makerspace tools or that sort of thing. And you sort of start to think creatively about how spaces can be shared. So not only can spaces be flexible, and the flexible kind of feeds into and helps as well, having the shared use at different sort of points in time during the day. And then that's a natural connection into the next dimension of time. And so one dimension of time is obviously school day versus not school day. Traditionally, our school facilities are really inefficient in the sense that they operate at full capacity for a very defined length of time during the school day, but really don't operate after that. And then we also have months that they sit empty during the summer. And so thinking about that element of time can be a first component of the conversation. But then in the pandemic, we also got very used to different uses of time for student groupings, right? And so in the pandemic case, a necessity of sort of spreading folks out, many schools went to a sort of 2-day on, 2-day off, 2-day work from home model. In the pandemic case, that looks like the same size of facility, but sort of if you are envisioning a non-pandemic world, that looks like needing half the facility that you currently do. And again, in the charter school case where you're very resource constrained, it's not necessarily that you want to build half the facility, but again, there's all of these other components that historically have been unattainable from a charter school perspective. You might not be able to build the gym or the auditorium or whatever that extra, shop or whatever that extra space is, because you have to absolutely get normal classrooms. Well, if you start to think creatively about time, both maybe which different days, but also even just time within the same school day. If students are off doing internships and that's staggered throughout the day, every time that you open up one space that's not being used, that starts to decrease again the strain on what facilities you're using. This is also something, another component that kind of starts to bleed through all three of these boxes is that the normal expectation for classrooms has always been, one teacher, one classroom. Well, that necessarily means that those spaces are sitting empty throughout the day when those teachers have prep periods, for example. Now, I happen to actually think that the model where teachers move is often not the right model for a school, but depending on the school's educational model, you can cut 13% off the top of your facility footprint just by saying, we're not going to do the one teacher, one space model. We're going to have a model where both teachers and students move around, just because of that one class period that's always going to be empty in general if you have a fixed assignment model. And so again, depending on what your particular school mission is, your educational model, how your curriculum interacts with that, time and space and use all kind of wrap around to say you can do creative things. And the more creative things you do, the more opportunities you have to do the extra facility components that otherwise you might think were outside the budget or were outside the ability as a charter school to be able to achieve them. So all of those are, again, just kind of general dimensions that as you start having conversations with your teams can help, you can form, and the white paper has specific questions sort of in each bucket, time, use, and space, that can help brainstorm with your teams, what are aspects that we can change, what are aspects that we've done a certain way historically that we don't need to keep doing that same certain way. What are things that we'd really like to be able to do as a school that we've always thought, well, but we can't do that? And then how could we maybe make that work? But inside of that, for all of this, it's really critical to have a very careful, very intentional process around all of that. And, we don't have to tell school leaders that we got a lot of experience with innovating and change during the pandemic. We also got a lot of experience with what happens when that change or innovation happens too quickly or without as much communication as it might have otherwise had, or without as much sort of prior testing than it otherwise had. And obviously then, the end result can be something where it's either at the very least not sustainable, where you can burn people out. That's maybe that's maybe the best case scenario when you don't have a sort of a really well planned and intentional process. The worst case scenario when you don't have that process is that you get direct pushback against whatever it is. And so it's not just a resource constraint, it's not a burnout issue, it becomes a pushback issue. And so in that sense, so, the white paper goes through, and then sort of on this slide, and we'll talk through each of these, kind of a general idea of process of what are the stages and sort of the process you can go through to create that real sustainable innovation. This is not in any way specific to facilities, for what it's worth. This applies regardless of what you're doing. Depending on what your background is, this probably looks similar to diagrams you might have seen of design thinking. This is very similar to design thinking. There's another methodology that I'll mention called strategic doing. That's also a component of kind of what informs this. At the end of the day, just like space, use, and time, the labels aren't really the important thing. It's just to get the ideas across. The same thing is true of the process that's on this slide. The labels are important. What you call it isn't terribly important. And actually, hopefully, as you sort of develop an innovation practice within your school and within your teams, you'll start your teams will have, and your school will have unique characteristics where you'll start tweaking what these are called or exactly how you go about doing them. And that's actually a really, really good thing, because that's the sign that you have a sort of a deep innovation practice that's being developed, and a deep sort of capacity for this sort of process that's being developed on your team. So just kind of walking through some of these steps and the ideas that they're communicating. So again, first and foremost, the key to having any sort of sustainable innovation is that it's inclusive, that it involves all parties and all parties on equal footing, and that there's not anything predetermined that's, well, here's the idea where we want to go, and so now we're engaging people so that we can convince them that that was the right thing to do. That's the opposite of what this process is really trying to get at. So it has to start in an equal footing, an inclusive basis, and really saying, okay, look, we're all here together. We all want the best school that we can have, and the best community that school can help create. And so, like, what have we learned, and what are the pain points? What are the highlights? What went well, what didn't go well, and how can that inform where we are going forward? And so, within that process of engagement, you start actually like explicitly just saying, okay, like, let's throw out every idea that we possibly can. And the key at this ideation stage is that all ideas are good ideas, definitionally at this stage. The idea is not to judge ideas in any way. The idea is not to have any pressure on people whatsoever that they might not want to say an idea because maybe it wouldn't be good. Every idea that someone has at this stage is good and is welcome and is exactly what the process is trying to get at. And so as you ideate, you're really just trying to say divergently, what are all of the possible things that we might start trying to look at, start trying to tackle, and how might we do that? As you move on, then the idea is to rapidly be able to test these. So you'll identify a particular couple of high priorities. It's really important in doing that, and this goes back to the engagement component. Throughout this entire process, nothing ever gets lost. No idea is ever being ended, and no idea is ever being discarded. And it's incredibly important. And you'll see that the whole process has the word communicate next to it in a box around it. And the point is just that you can't over communicate. If you're ever wondering, like, have we communicated enough? The answer is no. because there is no such thing as over communication. There's only under communication in this process. And so, as you do this, constantly reminding folks if their idea, doesn't happen to get selected, sort of proactively reminding everyone involved in the process that nothing is being lost along the way. Everything is being recorded. That's also incredibly important, that everything is recorded and documented, so everything can come back to later after you do a certain idea. But the point is, we have limited bandwidth. We want to get the most we can, and so we select a few maybe sort of big impact, low lift ideas to just get off the ground going. This idea of this big impact, low lift is a really key aspect to strategic doing, which again, I'll sort of mention and direct you to resources to at the end. But the point of the tests is not to figure out whether something does or doesn't work at all. It's to figure out what you can learn in the shortest amount of time. And so whether something works or doesn't, and is both not the point, but also is not even something, the question doesn't even really make sense, because what's guaranteed to be true about whatever idea you're testing is that it's not perfect. And so the idea with the test is learn as much as you can, as quickly as you can, with the fewest resources possible, and then move into the next stage, which is learning more. And so redesigning a new test, tweaking it, finding out something new, and continuing going back and forth between doing a test, analyzing the test, figuring out what was good, what was not as good, tweaking it, learning more. And all throughout that, clearly documenting it, the adaptations, why the adaptations were made. Because as you do all of this, you're doing this rapidly, flexibly with the least resources possible, which means in particular, you are absolutely generally, depends what the idea is, but generally you're absolutely not implementing this across your entire school. And so not everyone is involved with every test. And so for the next stage, implementation, it's going to be absolutely critical that in that test and iteration phase, you've really well documented why it is that certain things worked and certain things didn't, and how it went in each of those cases, so that then when you're presenting this and you're figuring out a plan for implementation and rollout and explaining it, the tendency is going to be, because all of your team members are very smart, very engaged people, they're going to raise their hand and say, well, what about X, Y, and Z? What about if we did this? What about if we did this? If you've done the testing and iteration right, sort of all of those things have already popped up. They've already been things that you've tested, you've iterated on, you've found the optimal path through those issues. But the only way that sort of any external party can trust that is if you have a really well documented process, and the process is what they trust. None of this is ever about agreement. It's never about sort of convincing someone with words. That's kind of the opposite of what all this is about. It's about doing something that's a low lift, that rapidly learns something, and then being able to, and the proof is in the pudding in all of these cases. It's in the test. How is it going? What did we actually see on the ground? Not how do we talk about this for a long time and then sort of still just at the end of all of those sets of meetings have a theory, but no real data on does it work or does it not work? And so again, with implementation in particular, this entire process was the idea of getting towards a facilities innovation idea or any innovation idea. Implementation itself should really basically run the same process. Engagement is critical up front. Ideation with how to implement, how to distribute this idea, this knowledge, this workflow, this process, whatever it is, across teams, across individuals who haven't done it yet, is really critical. Testing that. So you might roll out with a smaller subset to begin with, not everyone all at once. Iterating on how that rollout works. Every step along the way that was key to getting to the original idea is also key in figuring out how to take that idea and now spread it across your school, across your district, whatever sort of whatever body you're trying to implement across. And so, again, that was a sort of a really quick run through. The ideas for any of those sorts of innovation applications are simple. Like they're sort of self-explanatory. They just make sense. There maybe is a tendency to think like, well, yeah, like, okay, we get that, we understand that. I will say the rules are intentionally simple because that's what makes the processes work. They're also sort of they're very difficult to master though. And so being able to do those sorts of conversations well from the engagement standpoint, being able to design the tests really well, being able to figure out what are the right ways to navigate the implementation, all of those sort of take lots of iterations themselves. Like the process itself is you get better at it as you practice it. And so I guess I'll just say it's very helpful often if your team doesn't have a lot of experience running that sort of thing, to bring someone in to sort of help on the front end. And then that sort of helps build maybe a small core group of folks inside your district. And then those core folks can then go out and develop that skill set over time with lots of individual projects and practice over time with your teams. So all of that brings us back around to, we went through certain ideas, again, just ideas, just ways to sort of push one's thinking, to have a conversation with one's team and to say, how do we do things in each of these boxes where maybe we could do something differently? What have we always wanted to do that maybe one of these things could help us finally achieve? But then also talking through, the real importance of process and structure in how all of that works. So again, the three big points to layer over all of this are that it's really not just about facilities. Obviously, the process was, again, entirely about an innovation process, not about facilities innovation at all. And so facilities is just one aspect of what you can do with that as you build an innovation practice among your team. But it's critical that the facility conversation doesn't get cabined into its own little corner, because all of the ideas that were mentioned, kind of all of those depend on use of technology, both from a perspective of what your LMS or your SIS does, traditional sort of school technology, but also, do you need special scheduling software? A lot of that is kind of nascent. There's a few players that are building much more flexible tools to help with sort of dynamic scheduling, but a lot of that's just sort of starting. So there's aspects of that you've got to have the technology folks involved. What can we feasibly technologically do, and on what time frame? What apps do we need? What tools do we need? You have to have the curriculum folks involved, because if you're going to have these flexible spaces, you're going to be opening up more spaces. How you teach, and teachers generally have to be involved. How you teach, what the expectations are. If you're going to implement something like, well, we want to implement the idea of teachers move to. Well, if teachers aren't part of that conversation to begin with, that'll fail on day one for sure. And so those are the sort, like, it has to involve everyone else that would be involved in any other aspect of mission of the school. It can't be thought of as, well, it's just a facility. It's just kind of this mechanical thing. We just build it and then it works and we're done. And then again, what's right for one school may not be right for the other. None of these ideas are right ideas for any particular, or every particular school. They might be right ideas for one school, and they might be really, really terribly awful ideas for another school. As these conversations happen, again, this goes with sort of the no preordained answers. It's really important that what evolves out of the conversation is what's right for the particular school, for the particular mission, for the culture and the community, and for whatever the unique model is of that particular school. And then again, I can't emphasize enough, for any of this to be sustainable and therefore for it to be meaningful, it's easy, and often sort of innovation projects happen top down by one leader being particularly excited about them. And that's fantastic. It's great to have energetic leaders who really want to see change and sort of make it happen. But, for every one of those really energetic leaders, there's also a story of when that leader moves on, and all of those changes kind of falter in the best case scenario, and sometimes get reverse wholesale and not very, very long. And so to build a sustainable innovation that's not just dependent on having a leader that's particularly interested in this means, both being inclusive about the process. Again, can't emphasize that enough. But then doing these small iterative practices, these small iterative steps that build that skill set and that culture within your teams itself. And so regardless of who comes and goes, the culture of your school becomes one where these continuous improvements are constantly made. And so we'll open up for questions in a second. Before doing that, there are 3 resources that I think are particularly terrific that I try to sort of hand out freely whenever I can. All of these are completely free. And so one of them is, again, strategic doing. If you've heard of design thinking, if you use design thinking, this sort of innovation process, roughly speaking, that we were talking about, strategic doing is kind of a certain other flavor of design thinking that's really aimed at particularly where you might previously have constructed a strategic plan. So you talked about things a lot, and then many of us probably have the experience of doing a lot of work to get a really nice strategic plan that sits in a really nice binder on a shelf and doesn't go much farther than that binder. The idea of strategic doing is these small iterative steps that builds this practice and this culture among your teams. And then it makes it happen because it's focused on not planning, but it's focused on doing and learning through doing and figuring out what works through doing. So highly, highly recommend checking them out, and again, completely free resources. And then additionally, there's certification programs and that sort of thing that if you have staff that are particularly interested, great opportunity for professional development for your staff. The Stanford Design School has a K-12 lab that, again, is looking at kind of how do you do, and especially in that case, design thinking, but in the educational context. Again, fantastic resources, fantastic community, very helpful. Always, happy to talk to folks and to sort of share stories and share approaches to different ideas. And then if you're looking just kind of to have a library of ideas, again, I went into some very, very narrow, just couple of examples of schools or how different space might be used or things like that, just to scratch the surface. If you want kind of an encyclopedic library of what are really innovative schools doing right now across the country, Getting Smart is the place to find all of that. They go around, they keep up to date on kind of anything and everything that's happening everywhere. Interview folks, you'll find photos, you'll find sort of stories of what projects students are doing on any kind of educational innovation you might want to get an example for, you'll be able to find there. So with that, I think we'll open up generally to questions, discussion, what your experiences have been, what sort of outstanding questions you still have, what your particular facility goals are. Really, the rest of this time will be sort of totally yours to shape as you will. So thank you for joining us, and turn it over for questions. Maybe in the absence of questions, I'd love to hear just, again, kind of like what has you interested in the topic, what brought you to the particular conversation today, if there was anything that was particularly interesting or surprising, or maybe especially something that didn't seem to jive with your experience. Any sort of impressions, ideas, what brought you here, that sort of thing.
Hi, Andrew. I just want to take a second to introduce myself. I'm Shanice Hawkins. I am the charter, sorry, my title has changed. I'm the charter school specialist at the Indiana Department of Education. So for myself personally, I don't have a whole lot of facilities experience, but what I do have is funds for to help out the charter schools with their facilities. So I really appreciate you doing this, and also the kind of like going along with the white paper, because for me coming in as like a complete and utter newbie, I get questions all the time that I'm like, I don't know. So it's great to have these resources, especially the ones that you shared at the end. If I get questions, would you say the best way is to like point people to these resources, go back to the white paper? Some of the things, I get so many. I'm trying to kind of pinpoint one of the questions that I get. I don't know. I know that there's a lot of question, especially when kind of like expanding. So when a charter wants to maybe like improve on their facilities for like a special population. So I know recently I had one that was a preschool, but preschool for kids with special needs. Do you know of any kind of like additional resources in kind of those like very specific areas?
Sure. So no, I mean, I think that's a really good question. I think, so I'd say two things. So one, if you're a school that has like some very specific thing like that, excuse me, sorry, some like very specific, like, and maybe doesn't yet know exactly what it wants to do. Getting smart is a great place to go to see like, okay, is anyone else trying to do something with this particular population? Has anyone else done something? And again, one of the benefits of having those schools, and in my experience, if you cold reach out to any of the individuals who are doing that and saying like, I saw this really cool thing you're doing and I'd love to hear more about it. I've never had someone turn down having a Zoom coffee kind of thing about that. And the really great thing about that is that just like the sort of innovation process I was describing, where in testing and iterating, you're going to find all the things that were great ideas that turned out to be not so great in application. If they've gone through it, your experience, your community will be completely different. And so it's not a guarantee that, whatever happened in their case is the right answer in your case or that sort of thing, but they might be able to sort of short circuit some of those pitfalls and get you sort of farther faster. So that's one answer. The second answer really is that, I'll say, anyone sort of watching or anyone that reaches out to you, I'm always happy again to have that sort of in-person or Zoom coffee and just kind of talk through things. One of the things that's really helpful for a school that say it's already going and it's trying to do either a new kind of program or target, or maybe do an expansion or something like that, is a lot of these ideas of how do you get creative with time, or how do you get creative with space or use. A lot of that can really help answer the question of how do you figure out what's right before you make a big outlay of resources, whether that's time resources, people resources, money, of just, you build out a new, wing for your facility. And then you figure out like, well, but that wasn't quite what we needed in that wing. Like now we have to invest more money or more time or more people into sort of changing it after it happens. One of the really nice things about getting creative in some of those uses is that it can be used as the prototyping tool. So maybe you don't build out yet, maybe you don't go full scale yet, maybe you don't do that, but you can run kind of one of these innovation processes and within kind of a, what's the minimal time, resources, whatever else, to learn, okay, what should that eventual space look like before we build it, before we ever talk to a contractor or an architect or anything else, like way before any of that, we should really know what it is that we need. And we should not just think we know that it's the right thing by having thought it through, because it's not a matter of being smart or not. All of these, like, the number of times that I've been on a team of incredibly brilliant people and we've talked ourselves into thinking that something's the greatest idea ever, and then the instant you try it, you instantly realize like that was actually kind of the dumbest thing ever because it really just doesn't work. We missed this giant thing. The proof is in the pudding, the proof is in the doing. And so, getting creative, with your current space in ways that maybe you kind of constrain some of the other activities you're doing for a little bit, but in doing that, you enable, the test that lets you really know what's the right thing to do. And then when you go to the contractor or the architect and you're talking about, this is the space we need to design, you'll know that it's the right space, and you'll know it's the right space sort of from the get-go, from the first design, not find out later that it wasn't exactly what you wanted. So that was kind of a long answer to say, like, two avenues. One is look at Getting Smart, see if there's other folks who have done something similar, reach out to them for a Zoom call and sort of hear what their experience has been, what the ups and downs have been. And then secondly, think about how you can prototype and test within your existing facility, whatever that next phase is. And as part of that, again, I'm always super happy and quite frankly excited to hear from schools about interesting things that they want to try, and to sort of brainstorm with them about how they might do that. So I'm always very happy to have those sorts of conversations too.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I think a lot of times individual charter schools get so in the weeds of like wanting to do this thing that will help their kids that they sometimes feel siloed, and they don't have to. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Andrew, thank you very much for the presentation today. It will be available. The recording will be available in the next couple of days, and we will send more details out for the next webinar topic.
Sounds great.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
Have a good weekend.
You too.
You too.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.